kind of an odd arrangement for these Road to the Whitehouse events that some of you have been at before, which is from 11:30 to 12. You have a chance to have some lunch and to visit with each other. And then starting at 12, we have our conversation. There are three different groups putting this on. I'm thrilled to say that Dan Mazmanian, former dean of the School of Policy, Planning, and Development, the Drosian Center is here with us. Dan, I'm going to make sure people know you. And every third Wednesday, Dan is responsible for these events. Then we have a partnership with the Emergence Center in college, which is run by Dan Schnur. And every third Wednesday, Dan Schnur puts them on. And this is the third Wednesday, which is put on by the Annenberg School, where we try to feature a bit more journalists and pollsters, people interested in media. And we have a particularly good duo with us today for what I hope will be not just a presentation, but genuinely a conversation. So as Narda and Bob are talking, I hope you'll not just think of questions to ask, but points you want to make. We'll ask you to identify yourselves and then to be part of a genuine conversation. Narda Zacchino, as you know from her bio, was a top editor of the LA Times, built so many of the great institutions that we now identify with Los Angeles, including the LA Times Book Festival, and was a great reporter in many different places, including Sacramento. You love that, isn't it? And is now working on a book about California. She may tell you the title of it, which was suggested by her equally famous journalist, columnist, professor, and husband, Robert Scheer, who will be commenting on her comment title and also offering some perspectives of his own. So please join me in welcoming Narda Zacchino. Narda is a senior fellow at our Center for Education Leadership and Policy.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you all for coming. This is actually going to be part of a chapter in the book that I'm writing about California that Jeff mentioned. And I got interested in this topic because there has been so much in the media about Texas being the new California. And I learned in researching the subject that there are a lot of myths. There's some reality to that, but there are a lot of myths too that are being passed around, and especially by the media. So I want to talk a little bit about, what the picture looks like in Texas and what it looks like in California. And one of the reasons it's important, of course, is because they offer two models. California, in the last election, had all Democratic slate constitutional offices who were elected, and Texas is all Republican. And a lot of people look at Texas now because it's created so many jobs, which we're going to get into, that it's looked at as a national model. It's basically very few people, labor unions, very few regulations, inhibiting business and that sort of thing. So it's important to look at as, and really kind of dig down deep and look at Texas. And if this is the model that is the alternative to the Obama model of the Democrats, then it's worthy of some more scrutiny. But in any case, I would say that if Rick Perry were to tell this story, that great sucking sound you would hear is California's CEOs fleeing the state with their jobs and their corporations to go to the free market of Texas. And in Rick Perry's fantasies, California, which does have the largest economy in the country and the 8th largest economy in the world, if it were a country itself, would be overtaken by Texas in Rick Perry's dreams. It's also the most populous state, and Texas is number 2, so there's a lot of competition between these two states. Rick Perry and Texas have been making a real full-blown effort to try to get businesses to leave California. And it's been a very highly publicized campaign. There have been, I don't know if you've seen any, there have been billboards promoting the business-friendly climate in Texas rather than in California. There's been, he issues press releases every time another company leaves California to go to Texas or to open branches there or stores there or whatever, and that gets publicity. Texas is offering grants and tax incentives to companies in California to try to get them to go. Intel, which is based in a huge corporation, as you know, based in Santa Clara, and Sun Power Corporation, which is a solar power company based in San Jose, have both moved some of their operations to Texas because of these incentives. 2 weeks ago, Austin's top technology CEOs, I think that's the flyer up there, that was an advertisement that was on Bay Area websites. I just happened to run across it on looking at a Bay Area news site. Their top technology CEOs, and in the flyer, I believe it says all of them hiring, advertised their 2-day traveling roadshow recruiting in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, trying to get people to come from the tech sector in California, which is still pretty vibrant, to go to Austin. They offered Texas barbecue and drinks and a sales pitch to leave the Golden State. They also are stressing at every opportunity the fact that California has onerous regulations that hamper business development and innovation, and we'll get into a little bit of that. They portray Texas as a paradise that has no income tax, affordable housing. In fact, the median home price in Texas is $143,000 versus California's $249,000 median price right now, even though costs have dropped, significantly, values have dropped. They brag about swift permit approvals, which is something to brag about, actually, and a well-educated workforce, which is not something to brag about. I'll get to that. Perry sends letters to CEOs in California. He's really making an effort to try, not just California, but other states as well. He really wants Texas to be the #1 economy in the United States. This is how he likes to put it. If you want to live in a state that has high taxes, high regulations, that's favorable to smoking marijuana and gay marriage, then move to California. And then he says, in Texas, we still believe in freedom. I guess just not the kind of freedom we believe in. Freedom from over-taxation, over-regulation, and over-litigation. But in fact, if you compare the two states, it depends on what you're measuring and how you're measuring it in terms of who's the greatest state. California has indeed suffered a lot more than Texas in the recession. Its economy has declined 2.2% in 2009, and Texas just fell 1.5%. And for many, many years, from 2000 to like 2006, California and Texas had about the same unemployment rate. And keep in mind, the population is not that different. California's is like slightly larger. But California's unemployment spiraled with the housing meltdown. I think 600,000 jobs alone were lost just in the industries that relate to real estate, construction, mortgage brokers, and that sort of thing. 600,000 jobs in that area alone. So the unemployment rate in August in Texas was 8.5, which is 3.6 points less than California's, which is, I think, the second highest in the nation at 12.1%. However, Texas's unemployment, that was a spike. In June of 2009, it was 7.7%. And Texas lost 1,300 jobs just in August. There's also something going on where, and it's hard when you look at these figures because there's a large number of people who don't report that they're not working anymore. The unemployment figures don't reflect people who no longer are in the workforce looking for work, and a lot of people are out. So that's a little bit mushy. So in any case, maybe the picture in Texas isn't quite as bright. Texas is enjoying faster job growth than California. Texas did add 262,000 jobs between 2009 and 2011, and that's what has everyone talking. Texas has added like half the jobs in the United States have been added in Texas. And California this year may only add about 130,000 jobs, which is much less than the 200,000 that should be added given its population. So that California is really in a bad place with unemployment, and it's not going to get better. I just saw the Anderson forecast from UCLA, which is like the most respected forecast, I guess. UCLA, it's okay if I say that, right? And
it's the second one.
Second most influential. But it's really kind of dire. Predicts that unemployment is going to stay at 11.5% through 2013, so it's not a pretty picture. There are several reasons why Texas fared better in the recession and why it has some advantages over California and why the bragging rights are justified. Texas's oil and gas industry, which Bob is going to talk about, he's going to talk about, dig down a little deeper in oil and gas and also housing. But the oil and gas industry, Texas taxes its oil and gas, and those revenues help to bloat the state budget reserve to get it up to $9.1 billion. before this year, for the first time, it was tapped to balance the most recent budget. The surplus got a big boost in 2008 when oil was $145 a barrel, and that's when Kerry came into office. It was 6 times what the price was per barrel when he came into office. Prices still hover around $100 a barrel, which spurs job creation. That's one area where jobs are growing in Texas, as you might imagine. And related industries like petrochemicals and refining and those sorts of things, which California can't possibly lay claim to. So, and Perry, is one of the leaders in the Republican Party railing against regulations of any kind. He just challenged Obama to get rid of all the regulations, all government regulations in America, which is that happens to be really onerous for people. But in any case, it was strict government regulations in Texas that prevented the housing crisis from occurring there, because they have very strict rules on refinancing your home. And Bob's going to talk more about that, so I don't want to get into it right now. But it was because of government regulation that they were spared that. There were, California has the 3rd highest rate of foreclosures in the country, and Texas the 6th lowest. So there's a huge difference there. And of course, losing your home and losing those property taxes and everything else, it has a ripple effect on revenues. Texas has no income tax. That's a big selling point for a lot of people to move there, and for companies to move there and have a workforce to move there. California does have income tax. Texas has no corporate tax on capital gains. California's maximum corporate tax rate is 8.8%, and Texas capital gains at 9.3%. So long-term and short-term capital gains. So, and Texas is lower. This is a really important one. It takes longer to get permits for new businesses in California. This is a real problem here. For example, it can take 3 years to get a permit to build a mall in California. That same mall can get permitted in 3 to 4 months in Texas. So when you're trying to attract business to go to Texas, and businesses here have that problem, that's very attractive to them. In April, I talked about that delegation. In April, I talked about the people from Austin coming here. Well, in April, Gavin Newsom led a delegation of mostly Republican lawmakers and business leaders who went to Austin to talk to California businesses who've gone there and find out, why did you go here? Why did you come here? And on this trip was the guy who owns Carl's Jr., the company that owns Carl's Jr.'s. It's called CKE Enterprises. I think that was Carl Karcher Enterprises. And he's the CEO. His name is Andrew Pudzer. And he has kind of floated the rumor that he's going to move his Carl's Jr. headquarters from Orange County to Texas. He even got a phone call from Governor Brown asking him not to do that. But he said that it takes, he can get a new restaurant approved in Texas in 6 weeks. That it would take him 2 years. It takes 2 years to get a Carl's Jr. approved, to get all the permits and everything else in California. That shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be that way. That's a real legitimate complaint of businesses here. And so consequently, he's going to be opening 300 new restaurants in Texas in the near future. There's little debate about, I'm talking about that being a real problem, getting permits and the regulations that are sort of onerous and in California. And that is a problem that is recognized by a lot of Democrats, by the governor, by Gavin Newsom and his recommendations coming back from this trip. Something has to be done about that. The debate, though, is over the value of some of these regulations. So, for example, in Texas, strengthening the rights of workers is viewed as an inherently unfriendly to business. So if you have a happy workforce, if you're more fair to your workforce, if you strictly enforce, one of the issues is enforcing overtime after an 8-hour workday instead of a 40-hour week, which bothers some people in Texas. Then I think the most important one is the environmental laws in California, the regulations, the so-called green laws that mandate manufacturers to seek alternatives to toxic chemicals, the state's carbon emission laws. Those things are portrayed in all of this Texas publicity and stuff as job killers. And Chief Executive Magazine, which has chosen Texas as the best state in the union to do business, and California as the worst state to do business for the last 7 years, has cited these environmental laws as job killers rather than that this is good for the environment. So I know that one great example that I'm looking at for my book is the Port of Los Angeles, which has Mayor Villaraigosa has this program to go green to get green, and it's really working at the port where they green-lighted a lot of construction projects. Remember I talked about the onerous regulations? Well, they green-lighted some and put on the fast track a lot of construction projects at the port because they accepted the environmental regulations, and they're going to be green buildings. And so it's going to, someone who's on the Port Commission told me that these environmental regulations are going to save the warehouse owners, the terminal owners, money in the long run for utility costs and whatnot. And they're actually creating 1 million jobs. I haven't, don't ask me how right now because I'm still looking into this. But she said it's creating 1 million jobs directly or indirectly from these environmental regulations that these people are following in the port. So that's, in any case, environmental regulations are very, very important. Now, in contrast, because environmental regulations help not just the companies to make more money, but also, of course, help the people of the state, the residents of California. Texas, in contrast, leads the nation in the dirtiest air, the amount of toxic chemicals released into the water, and hazardous waste generated. They are the #1 state of the 50 states in these areas. This comes from a report called Texas on the Brink, which was a really good resource. It's a publication of the Texas House of Representatives Legislative Study Group. In fact, Texas dumps more carbon pollution into the atmosphere than any other state, more than California and Pennsylvania combined. And in addition, during his first term, Governor Perry signed legislation to speed construction of 11 new coal plants in Texas. They care very little about the environment there. It means that businesses can speed their projects through and make more money. He's also led the move to undermine the EPA's right to limit greenhouse gases and has sued the government to stop the implementation of that in Texas. The report also noted, the Texas on the Brink report, also noted that Texas has the highest percentage, because if you think of why a company would want to move there, these are the things that aren't mentioned in these stories. Texas has the highest percentage of uninsured children in the nation, the highest percentage of residents without health insurance in the nation, the highest percentage of residents of non-elderly uninsured. More than 6 million people in Texas have no health insurance. 17.2% of the population lives in poverty, compared to only 13.2% in California. And Texas ranks 4th among the 50 states in the number of children living in poverty. It also has the highest percentage of minimum wage jobs in the country. So when you talk about Texas creating all these jobs, it's not like we're talking about high-paying jobs. And remember I mentioned that one of the bragging rights is that there's this well-educated workforce just ready to start working for your company. Well, Texas is last among the 50 states in the percentage of residents with a high school diploma, and near the last in their SAT scores. So that's the workforce that's waiting for California companies. But you can see that you can throw these statistics around and you can kind of slice them and dice them and look at them in many different ways. And it's very simplistic to compare these two states. They're very different. Texas has the oil, that benefits it very much. California has entertainment. California has the wine industry that Texas doesn't have. So they're not exactly, apples and apples. But if the national media, one of the problems I have with the national media coverage is that they really don't look deeply. They don't put these things into context. And so they can talk about Texas being this bright new light in the future, but they don't really dig down deep enough. California would look much better if they did because, and by the way, Jeff told me to mention the title of the book. The title of the book at the moment is going to be called Still Golden, because right now we see it as still golden. But there's a lot to be said for California. And just comparing it to Texas again, in the first 9 months of 2010, California entrepreneurs received $8.6 billion. This is in 9 months. $8.6 billion for all you young entrepreneurs out here who want to start your business. in 832 venture capital deals. So venture capitalists came from all over the country and gave Californians in 832 deals $8.6 billion. This compares to, in the same time period, for Texas, $833 million for 104 deals. So California received, and it even went up in 2010, where California got 50% of all the venture capital money in the United States. So $1 of every $2, California got it. And in contrast, so 50% versus Texas is 4%. California's port is very vibrant. In January alone, California shipped $11.7 billion worth of goods abroad, a number that hasn't been seen since 1987, so that's really a great sign for California. I mentioned the agricultural base with the wine production. California, because it's the most populous state, also has the biggest market for goods. So a lot of companies will stay in California because that's where most of their customers are. And people like to live in California, and they'll stay in California. And everyone's not going to move to Texas. By the way, they cite the population. They cite the fact that so many Californians are moving to Texas, and it's true. From 2007 to 2009, when the housing market crashed here, 2 million people moved out of California, and the top destination was Texas. It was only 12%, but that was the highest percentage of anyone going to one state. So 2 million moved out, went to Texas, mostly 12%. But more than 1 million Texans moved out of Texas during that time, and most of them came to California. So, like I said, it depends on how you look at these figures. Housing prices are lower in Texas, but they don't have crop 13. And so even though the median house price is less, taxes are higher there, property taxes. So for every $100,000 of a house value in Texas, the tax is $1,800, and in California, it's $477. This is another reason that when they talk about the low housing prices, the taxes are higher there. I want to let Bob get to what he's going to talk about, so I just want to see. The last thing I want to talk about is the deficit. California has a huge deficit. It's going down now. We have more revenues coming in, so that's shrinking, which is good. But when California was facing this huge deficit, it was national news, and people talk about the failed state and this and that. Texas actually just came through a period where, and now it's facing in January it was facing a $27 billion deficit, bigger than California's. And they had to write off, they had to borrow against their rainy day fund. Remember I mentioned that $9 billion surplus they had? They had to tap into it, much to Perry's consternation, as he vowed he would never tap into that. They had to try to balance the budget. They made $15 billion in cuts, most of them to social services. So when I talk about, the poverty rate in Texas, how many children are living in poverty, the uninsured, you can imagine what the social costs are from all that, the ramifications of that. They cut $15 billion out of all their programs, their health programs, education. They cut $4 billion out of education for the first time in the last 40 years in Texas history, that they had to cut education. So it's not that the picture is so bright in Texas right now, and that Perry is sort of running away from that a little bit. When people talk about the deficit, he just kind of shrugs. But I want to read you what Wells Fargo wrote about in June. They were talking about, Wells Fargo Securities was looking at Texas and said, the Texas budget defers payments, uses accounting tricks, and discounts population growth in order to fully fund and balance the state budget. As it stands, the budget ignores the projected caseload growth in key government services such as Medicaid, underfunded by nearly $5 billion, so that's going to be added to the deficit, which means there may be a huge budget shortfall to cover in the next legislative session. So it looks like the Golden State is the only one that's a little tarnished here, and I would hope that the media would do a better job of covering that story and putting all of this into context, which I hope I did for you today. If you see the stories about how great Texas is, you might think about all the things I've told you. And Bob is going to talk just now about sort of giving a more national look at Texas, I think, and talk about their housing and oil.
I thought you really covered it all. I should point out, Narda was the bureau chief for the LA Times back in, I guess, what, 79, 80. And it was funny to have people here from the Jess Hubbard Institute, because I have such a vivid memory of other live.
By the way, Dan Schnur, just so people can recognize you, he's joined us since, and every third week at the Emergence.
Yeah, I like it. So I really like that a lot, but he was certainly a wild California character. I do want to say, it's a sort of reminder, I'm only a researcher on this book. I had a book on the banking crisis a couple of last year, and I'm still working on that issue. And really, I'm here because we argue about this all the time. And when Narda started writing this book, she was much more pessimistic about California than I am. And so, over breakfast and so forth, we disagree. So let me just state my own view, and I think we've come closer. And my job is really to say, how can you say that? And then I'm here with some other material and so forth. So it's a work in progress. But I do think that the basic problems of California and Texas are national in scope. I think it's absurd to be arguing about state politics, particularly when you're dealing with a presidential election. And I think the basic problem, the housing problem, is certainly a national problem. It has to do with deregulation, and we're not going to visit that issue in detail. Texas handled it better, and that's the main reason for the discrepancy in these statistics, not because Texas was the wild, deregulated state, but just because exactly the opposite. If deregulation and freedom to build and everything were the answer here, Nevada and Arizona would be great success stories. They are the basket cases now. And they have the wild, deregulatory, blah, 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 you can go where you want, no tract homes and so forth. That's not what saved Texas. What saved Texas is something that actually existed in many states, but prior to Texas becoming a state in 1845, there had been a very strong populist feeling in Texas. And Texas, like Iowa, like a number of other states, actually was dominated by an anti-banking sentiment. The banks had come with the railroads. The banks had ripped off ranchers. The banks had impoverished people. So in the original Texas Constitution, going back to Mexican code, banks were actually banned at first. And they were banned from making home loans, because the idea was they will swindle you. You won't have the right information. They're hustlers. You will lose your ranch. You will lose everything you care about, and so forth. And it was only by 1997 that you could actually have second home equity loans, second mortgage, take some equity out over the primary loan in Texas. It's very recent. And over the years, while banks have been able to get into the mortgage business, Texas has had the most regulated housing market in the country. So the success of Texas in having the lower foreclosure rate and fewer homes and securitized and involved in all this thing is not a result of deregulation, it's a result of regulation. And if Perry is going to run on this, someone's going to call him on that. Because in Texas, as opposed to California, you couldn't get those kind of liar loans. And you couldn't get something worth more than the appraisal. In Texas, very strictly regulated, you can only get an 80% to value loan. The value is supposed to be determined very carefully. You can't do the cash out, wild stuff. You can only refinance once a year. There's much more transparency in the loan process. It's all a matter of code. You can Google it, you can read it, you can become quite expert in an hour and a half if you want to question this. But you have your right to rescind, your right to inform. There's actually something called clear language in the Texas law that has to be understood. If you've ever gone to get a home loan here in California, you know you can't make your way through it. In Texas, that was not the case. So if Texas is going to be trumpeted as a model for the country in relation to housing, it should be trumpeted as an example of sensible regulation, of an intrusion on the side of the consumer. And Elizabeth Warren, of course, would be the person to vote for president, not Perry. I also want to make a point on this regulatory, deregulatory argument. You know, everybody forgets, but California has had Republican governors, and we've had people who claim they were very much for deregulation and so forth and so on. And you know, it's one of the reasons we had Prop 13. And it's one of the reasons we were open to the Texas company Enron that was able to game our system, because we've gone through deregulation in relation to the supply of energy and trading of it and so forth. So we, when we look at California, you can say it's always been a deep blue state of these wild liberals who want wild regulation. We've had lots of experiments. And sometimes we've been much looser. I guess Prop 13 would be a very good example. And I think we were looser in housing. And one irony is the main source of Texas success is obviously they possess oil and natural gas. And through new technology and also expansion into different kind of drilling techniques and different fields, as was pointed out when Perry was first in, the oil revenues much lower, and oil counts for 40% of the jobs and job creation in oil and its related stuff. In Texas, ironically, in Texas they tax it at the wellhead, and in California we don't. So even in that area, to which we have oil, we get less from it than they do in Texas. And so I just want to point out that in Texas there's been a strong populist tradition. And that populist tradition, in addition to, yes, we don't want government interfering in a lot of things, has also had a very healthy respect for the rights of consumers, of the ordinary individual not to be consumed. Now, there is one national issue that California and Texas share, and I'll conclude on this, but it has haunted Perry, and since the thrust of this is the presidential race, let me bring it up, and that's immigration. And in neither state can you really get rid of immigrants, documented or undocumented, without destroying the state's economy. I'll just put that out there. It's my prejudice, and I think I can back it up in a few hours. But it's a reality that both Perry and Governor Brown would recognize. And that's why Perry has taken what I think to be a very enlightened position on immigration. George W. Bush also took what I thought was basically an enlightened position. And it would be pretty difficult for me to imagine a Texas politician wanting to round up immigrants, undocumented or otherwise. And just to give you one example of that, the fact is there's a great deal of cross-border activity between Texas and Mexico. And the strong manufacturing area in Texas now have to do with the assembly of automobiles and other material that is produced in Mexico. And the work is done in Mexico. And the reason that Perry doesn't want this fierce wall and vigilantes and everything is because cross-border trade is essential to the economic well-being of Texas. And there's an awful lot of, as I say, parts produced there, roto, reassembled, stamp made in America, and so forth. It's been a game going on for a long time. But one thing Texas and California share in common is they're both states that were basically seized from Mexico. Let's cut to the chase. It's normal that there be a substantial Latino population as part of the workforce. And I think the most attractive thing about Perry is the one thing that has caused him the most trouble in Republican primaries has been this immigration issue. So we should put that out there. I think that's all I have.
Good. Let's open this for discussion. I just want to put one other interesting.
I'm sorry, not correctly, but I thought I said it right. They tax in the oil in Texas, and we don't. I did say it.
No, but it's interesting. You guys mentioned two, and I want to add a third way in which California is more, quote unquote, Republican than Texas. So you had a couple actually, Bob. I guess regulation of housing would be one of which we're more Republican or less regulated. A second one is Prop 13, that is we tax our property at a much lower rate than Texas does. The third is the no severance tax. We don't tax oil as it's extracted from the ground. If Texas didn't, if they had the same policy we do, their budget would be vastly further out of whack. If we did, ours would be less out of whack. That's the third way in which we're more Republican. But the one which you didn't mention is we also have limits in the state. I don't think Texas does anything wrong on personal injury lawsuits. Some of you remember during the debate over health care, one of the proposals was that there be limits on personal injury lawsuits because it creates a problem, it's perceived to be a problem for physicians and particularly for insurance companies. California has a very low limit on how much can be recovered in personal injury lawsuits. I don't know if Texas has that, but they may not. So it'd be interesting to sort of compile the ways in which we are more Republican,
Yeah.
if that's the right phrase. But let's open this for discussion. Interestingly, Perry is now running for president, maybe declining a little, maybe he'll come back and be their nominee, maybe he'll become president. We have a governor who nobody thinks is running for president, but actually has run for president before, at a time when California was golden. So interesting, and he's sort of, my favorite ad of the campaign was the one in which Meg Whitman says, when I came here, this was such a fabulous state, and it was so well governed. And look at it now. And it says, wait a minute, who was the governor? And of course, he's still around. Okay, so let's go.
I want to just make one footnote on that also. When we talk about the national housing meltdown, it's a matter of fact, even though columnists like Paul Krugman and other more liberal people that I very much admire somehow ignore it. But under Ronald Reagan, I mean, by the way, I first interviewed before he was governor, rather liked. Under Ronald Reagan as president, the regulation of the financial community was tightened rather than loosened because of the savings and loan scandal. It remained for Bill Clinton and a Texas senator named Phil Graham, who was head of the banking committee, to do the radical financial deregulation that allowed the housing meltdown. But if you go back in the record, in Reagan's last years, he tightened banking, and he also tightened offshore tax shelters because he was so furious that his own company, General Electric, was now harboring and was now putting this money abroad. So if you look at the record, it actually, even though Reagan man had the dream of radical deregulation, he did not in any way fulfill that in terms of the financial community, and it was Bill Clinton who opened the floodgates.
So let me just open with a question for you too, and then I really would like people to come in not just with questions, but with comments and observations of your own, so that we turn this into a true conversation. Back at the period that you're talking about, back in the 1970s, Texas was a Democratic state. California was a more mixed state. Generally, with the exception of the Browns, always Republican governors. Now this state seems to, and in presidential races, it's generally Republican. Now California seems to be a solidly Democratic state. Texas seems to be a solidly Republican state. Why did they go in such divergent directions?
Well, I'm not sure this is set in stone, but I do think in California, I think the decisive difference, certainly in the last election, was a very well-organized Latino community here in Southern California that reversed the politics of the state. And I think you have a much stronger union movement in California, certainly among government workers, obviously in the service sector. And that political organization, a combination of unions that have reached out to immigrant workers, in the case of the SEIU and others, the ability to organize a Southern Los Angeles vote, did something that I don't think the national press paid enough attention to, which is the amazing victory of basically a liberal Democratic state, a slate company. However, a quick answer would be oil. I mean, I think Texas has been able to paper over some of its difficulties with obviously having this gift that the rest of the country can't share. If the price of gas goes up, the rest of us suffer. It's hard to campaign on that. You know, you're benefiting. But I think it allows them to paper over a lot of differences. But if Texas runs into the kind of economic problems they're having, I think they'll swing over to more of the Democrats. And the redistricting will help the Democrats in Texas.
I think if you go back to Pat Brown, and you go back to, I think that's where the state, and Dan would probably have greater insights in this than I'm going to offer, but the state started becoming more conservative when the students at the University of California had the sit-ins, and there were the arrests, and then you had riots, you had the racial riots, you had at the same, happening around the same time, a little bit later, was the property that housing values were going up and the property taxes were going up. You had forced school busing for integration. People voted against that, and their vote was overturned. You have the Rumford Fair Housing Act. I mean, I'm lumping all of these things together. which banned discrimination in housing and rentals and, correct me if I'm wrong, but, and sales of homes. And that was passed by the legislature. Governor Brown was a strong supporter, kind of wrestled it through. That was repealed by the voters. That was overturned by the courts. And I think what you had in California was you had a movement where it started becoming more conservative. And that up until Pat Brown, I mean, there were a series of more moderate governors, whether they were Republican or Democratic. And you had the business community on board with whether they were Republican or Democratic, because I think there was sort of a feeling, maybe this is just too idealistic, but that good things were being done for the people of California. California was growing as a state. There was a lot of, there was a lot of infrastructure work being done. The schools were expanding. The University of California was expanding. And this was all seen as positive for the state. And then I think gradually people began to feel a little bit like they were losing control. And I think that's, and when Proposition 13, there were I think there were 5 or 6 tax cutting initiatives that were on the ballot before Prop 13 passed. That failed because the voters were fearful that, education would be cut too much, some of the services would be cut too much. So they kind of, were less willing to have all that happen. And then the other thing about Texas, and so anyway, I believe that the state did become a little more conservative than it was under Pat Brown, and took a little turn to be more conservative. However, at the same time, Texas, I think that fundamental Christianity has something to do, and I have done no research on this, but it just seems to me, I mean, you have a Governor Perry, the state is suffering the worst drought in modern times, and fires burn, homes are lost, and his solution is to tell all the people of Texas to get on their knees and pray to God to stop the drought. I can't imagine that happening in California. I can't imagine Governor Brown.
What if it works?
Yeah, not so far. But I think that, Jeff, I think that's one of the main differences between Texas and California.
It'd be interesting at some point for somebody, and maybe people have done that research. I just don't know
Yeah.
how California went in the Democratic
that's
direction.
very interesting,
Texas went in the Republican direction when they both started with something similar. Let's get people into this conversation. Once again, it can be a question, but you can make a point or a paragraph if you want. And first introduce yourself to that.
Oh, yeah, I just had a comment.
Yeah. But introduce yourself first.
My name's Parker Ray. I'm actually from Texas, I'm from Dallas. I'm a graduate student in the Annenberg program in National Real Estate Development. And I just had a comment about, it may be a question you guys probably have done nothing research on it. In terms of Texas swinging, the opposite. It seems, at least from what I know in my conversations with, family members, that even though Texas was democratic, prior to, I think it was, every house was democratic prior to 1990 or something. That wasn't for 6 or 7 years. That had much more to do with, it was a different Democratic Party than was in lots of other parts.
It was a Southern Democratic Party.
Yeah,
Martian
it's
service.
the Blue Dog.
Blue Dogs.
And so it was not as much, they were, most of them are currently Republicans. Now, it's the switch parties.
Well, Rick Perry switched parties. Rick Perry used to be a Democrat.
But he was Al Gore's campaign chairman in Texas in 1988.
So was Bill Graham, the Democrat, Richmond. But let me just, I just want to say one thing. Depends what we mean by, I think it depends what we mean by conservative. It's quite true. When Lyndon Johnson embraced the civil rights movement and certainly was more unpopular and he alienated a certain base, I think if we think of social conservatives, then I think Narda's point is valid. In California clearly is a socially liberal state. And I can't speak for Pete Wilson, but I think he represented that kind of social liberalism. You mentioned a number of other governors. I would even argue Ronald Reagan was a social liberal in that respect. He famously said on the question of homosexuality, I don't care what you do, quoted from the trial of Oscar Wilde, as long as you don't do it in the street and frighten the horses. And it's pretty difficult to imagine a California Republican winning and being social conservatives in that respect. And I think the reason Perry's playing on homophobia and another thing, issues, marijuana, what have you, is he is appealing, as Narda says, to a Christian socialist or a right-wing Christian socialist base. I do think one factor we're leaving out here is the role of trade unions. And trade unions are a major organizing force in California in a way that they are not in Texas for a whole number of reasons. But to understand the electoral process and getting out the vote, I can tell you Dolores Huerta, the legendary leader of the farm workers, told me the Democrats would win in this state, I think 2 months before it happened, when they didn't look like they were doing so well. And I said, well, how can you believe that? I said, because we've got to get out the vote. Enthusiasm going. So I wouldn't discount
Dan, did you have a question too that you want to ask her, or did that address that?
Oh, well, one other, just one brief point, it's just that, in Perry, it's interesting that Perry kind of framed himself as the Texan against the rest of the country, when, if you ask most Texans what they think about Rick Perry, he's barely won, every time that he's won, and rarely faced, strong opponents. Even if you ask really conservative Texans, they're not comfortable with most of a lot of things he says.
He had two Republicans facing in the primary in 2010.
Okay, anybody else here from Texas, by the way?
By the way, let me just say, I just looked this up. Texas has the percentage of employees represented by unions is only 6.7%. California, it's 18-something.
Gentleman with the...
What's the difference? Stephen Hubbard, SPPD, DPPD, Doctor of Public Policy, Energy and Sustainability. What's the difference in the health statistics? Because I look at Texas, what I see basically the corporations doing is they're polluting, they're not paying for the environmental damage, and so I feel like, you were in politics, you'd come up with a catchphrase, see Texas and die. Because Texas City, and other places that have such a notorious reputation. So I was wondering, when you look at literature from people who visited the Eskimos around 1900, who saw no evidence of cancer, and now today you can say the cancer rates in industrial societies on the average are 10 to 100 times what they are in non-industrialized societies.
That would be very interesting to look at. That report I told you called Texas on the Brink, you can just Google that. They have I didn't look at all the indices because I just discovered it last night, and I just went into it to look, kind of cherry pick things. But they do have a section on health, so there might be some reference to it there.
I just want to point out something. There's always there are going to be 2 or 3 Texas, and there's going to be 2 or 3 Californias. There's a Texas that has obviously very high level of medical excellence that pulls patients from all over the world. It gets a lot of federal funding. 40% of the new jobs that he's bragging about were in basically government-supported medicine and other governmental activities in Texas. So they have a vibrant, they have a major defense industry presence, and they're part of the military-industrial complex. And I remember Narda used to be the editor of the LA Times in Orange County. Everybody in Orange County thinks, oh, we're all self-made. Except it was, those good old Pat Browns who stole the water from them and brought up the highways and did everything else. So people are anti-government until government is...
actually, an interesting statistic to see if you could get. I know California, and Dan, you may know these numbers, or one of the Dan's may, or somebody else may, but we get like 78 cents for every dollar that we send back to Washington, something like that from California. What's the percentage in Texas? It would be interesting to know, though. It would just be interesting to know what... Because here, we are a net deficit tax state.
There is a paper out there, I've seen it, I can't remember, it might be University of Pennsylvania.
Somebody here will have it.
Yeah, some of them.
Somebody will find out.
This is like my
job. Yeah, it's over here.
If I may ask a broad question to
And you introduce yourself first, please.
I'm Lee from Korean Institute. My favorite quote is in Old Testament, strangely, Proverbs 29:18. It says, where there is no vision, people perish. What they mean is that political leaders should have a vision to look ahead and prepare and run the country accordingly. Now, I'm asking the same question to journalists and professors. It's good to know what happened, but what they're teaching students, what they're teaching the public, and what we should do in the future to make this better. So my question to you is, Am I expecting too much? GOP Democrats work together, set aside their difference, and work for the good of America, good of the people. Considering Perry is a man of vision, and now I'm asking you.
I don't think he's a man of much vision, personally. I mean, from what I've read in my research, especially after all this, and you know, he is, especially on the environment, very bad on the environment in terms of global warming, climate change. He thinks it's all a bunch of phooey and a waste of money, and he doesn't think the science is in, and that sort of thing. And it's just, to me, that doesn't show any vision. If, you know, this like 99, the science is done, the science has proven it. But, you know, in terms of Republicans and Democrats, this is a big problem for me, because when I was bureau chief in Sacramento during at the end of Jerry Brown and the beginning of Truthdig, and at that time, I remember when I went up there, I'm a Democrat, and when I went up there, I didn't have any really care about government and doing the right thing for the people, and people who, politicians who only want to do right things for themselves and their friends. And so, but what really bothers me is that at that time, which was, as Bob said, it was in 1979, 80, 81, around then, you know, they got things done. They would, Democrats and Republicans, they would disagree, maybe even publicly, vehemently maybe. And they would go to Frank Fatts or someplace, and they'd sit down and they would, you know, say, okay, look, you know, I'll give you this, you give me that. And it wasn't a perfect system by any means, and a lot of bad stuff got passed and got done, and a lot of special interests were catered to. But you didn't feel the vitriol that's there now. You didn't feel the polarization that, I mean, I remember, I personally, and maybe I'm naive, I was shocked when Jerry Brown wanted to put on the ballot and let the people of California decide whether to extend those taxes. And I thought, well, that's the Democratic thing to do. Let the people vote on it. That's what he campaigned. He couldn't get, like, what was it, 3 votes from Republicans to put it on the ballot to let the people of California make that decision about the, you know, do you want to have us cut all these programs, or do you want to pay, you know, $3 more a month or whatever it was. And that was disappointing to me. And I don't know the answer, because it's in Washington, and I think the New York Times just had a story, I think last week about, within the last week about, last Sunday I think, how Jerry Brown is finding this is a totally different environment than when he was there before. So I don't know.
We only have 5 minutes left, and I want to get a few more voices in. Maybe I could go around and have people then get several comments, and then Daci's question, but brief, and then we'll finish with comments from the 2 of you. This woman here.
My name is Jackie Chen. I'm an undergraduate student studying business. And from my perspective, if finding a job is the main concern for students coming out of USC or in California school, would it be more beneficial to go to Texas to seek employment, or should I stay in California?
Okay, keep that in mind. We're going to get a few more comments or questions. Maybe over, yeah.
I'm Joe. I'm a grad student at SPPD. This is a tax question. Do you believe that there's an actual rift between Harry's camp and W. Bush's old camp? Like, is there animosity? Is that more of a media story, or is there any solid foundation to that?
When you get 3 or 4 more comments in the back there.
I'm an undergraduate studying political science and economics, and one thing I feel has been a major issue for California is that as it tries to move forward, it's a very progressive state in terms of worker protections and environmental protections. It has to come not only internationally, but within its own country, against Texas, which completely doesn't worry about those things at all. So how do you think that that's going to play out? That's going to play out in the future. If maybe there will be more national policies that'll make some more consistency that'll help California, or if they're going to continue to lose the fight in terms of jobs to Texas, because Texas doesn't care about the issues of worker rights and environmental protections and things like that.
Okay, we take one more, and then it's going to be a real challenge with these guys. In 2 minutes, you're going to wind the whole thing up. So it's going to be 1 o'clock. Is there one more question that somebody wants to have? Where? Yeah.
This is really brief. This idea that jobs move from California to Texas because of better tax rates or regulation, whatever it is, doesn't seem to be an enormously strong suggestion for national job growth because it's job neutral, right?
Yeah.
Circling around the country. What Rick Perry, we've got more half of all the American job growth seems to be based a lot on immigration, which is why the unemployment rate is still pretty high, even though they've had so many job growth, so much job growth. That does seem to be a somewhat productive strategy for the U.S. National.
A quick answer for me, starting with Scheer and ending with Narda.
First of all, I want to go defend and attack Rick Perry since that keeps coming up. I don't think he's some monster. I think he's been successful because he can reach out. And I think if he wins, he's going to do pretty much what any president will do, which is cater to Wall Street. And try to get the economy going in terms that are appealing to large corporations. I think it's a failed strategy, but I don't think there's going to be that much difference between Romney, Perry, or unfortunately Obama, who has turned to exactly the same kind of people. And I think Texas has to be a moderate state. He knows that. On the question of jobs, the critical thing here is what kind of America are you going to have? Whether you go out for work or you're talking about the jobs in Texas. Are the good jobs going to continue to be exported? The head of Obama's Jobs Council, the head of GE, 2/3 of their jobs are now overseas. 82% of their profit is overseas. The jobs that have been created in Texas are largely, they lead the country along with Mississippi. They're tied with Mississippi in minimum wage or below minimum wage jobs. So when you're really talking about one of these quality jobs that you want to have, or other people want to have, can you support a family? Can you be lifted out of poverty? We now have 22% of children living in poverty. We have the highest number of people in poverty. So no, Texas does not provide a model. I think California, because of the venture capital, because of the higher tech, because of the better education system, provides a much better model of how to get out of this nightmare.
Still golden, Narda.
Oh, it's still golden, right? I think you should get a job wherever you can get a job that you really want to do if you want to get up in the morning. And it might be in Vermont. I mean, you don't know where it's going to be.
That's going too far.
And that's what I think about jobs. I can't answer the question about the Bush Bear. Yeah, Bush Perry. Maybe Dan has
It's a Karl Rove question.
It's a Karl Rove question.
Karl Rove had his animosity to Perry. It's not ideological, and it's just one of those things, and it will go away.
I'd like to know it.
Okay, Dan, do you want to give us a very quick answer, if you can tell us? It's Dan, who has been a major operative in the Republican circles, and in his past, he's regained his virginity. Dan, what do you have to say to the Perry Bush feud?
My impression is that there is a pretty serious animosity there, based on Bush's last campaign for governor of Texas in 1996. Rove wanted Bush to win by a very large margin, in particular to do as well as possible among Hispanic American voters in order to position himself for a presidential campaign. Perry was running a much more highly contested race, so they had two different strategies on how to approach the campaign. Rove and Perry's advisors went at it. Both say that the other side misled them, but it seems to me that animosity is continued to this day.
Narda, last words?
Well, I think we didn't answer your question, and I must say I lost track of one of the 5 questions. What was yours?
It's about just the California being in Texas and how that's going to be handled going forward nationally and pushing solutions for that.
Okay, I'll just repeat because he's going to kick us out of the room in a second, but I do believe that the main issue is quality of life. The American dream is based on the idea that income will increase, your kids will do better, and so forth. Unfortunately, we've had what now is being called the lost decade. We're back to the level where Clinton came in. Median income in this country, Hispanics have lost 60% of their wealth, African Americans have lost 53%, everyone feels poorer, consumption doesn't come back. So what really is at issue now is the American dream. And the American dream is based on good jobs. And those good jobs have to have workers' comp. They have, they have to have all of these things. They can't pollute the environment and so forth. We don't want to be a nation of people who are scrambling to compete with what used to be thought of as third world jobs. And I think that is the real issue. And I must say, I have one point that I want to raise. I don't think the main thing that's being discussed by the Republicans, some are, if they're libertarians like Ron Paul, but in the main, they're blaming something called big government. They're not blaming Wall Street. They're not blaming big government, which has been basically bought by big interests. They're not blaming the big military spending, running up these enormous deficits for 2 wars that you didn't finance. So what is this big government that they're talking about? And it seems to me it's mostly government that is the government that the people who finance both parties want to have, and that delivers to them, and that we don't really have much of a choice in this election. We're debating between the vision of a Robert Rubin, who was with Goldman Sachs, and a Phil Graham, who's now with UBS. And that represents the two-party alternative, and it's not very satisfying.
Please join me in thanking Bob Scheer. Dan, is yours for next week?
Yes, it is.
Conversation next week with Dan Mesmani in policy planning and development. And maybe Bob and Narda will stay around for a few minutes and maybe the Dan's will for conversation.
Good.